Hi there, it's Marzena. So, I must admit that after Valentine's and International Women's Day, I got used to having a vase with red roses somewhere in the house. And since my birthday is just around the corner, I decided to make myself a bouquet of red roses that I will be able to display forever. A perfect chill spot for a rose fairy. Let's dive in. Of course, I wanted this rose fairy to be very beautiful. Abominable is not the most common choice for such characters because of her strong jaw, but I was up to the challenge. The only thing that has to go were her hands. Abby's original hands are way too massive, so I switched them for this pair of delicate hands from one of my Frankie dolls. Then I could finally start the preparation. The hair is always the first thing to go. I cut them as close to the scalp as possible with my sharpest scissors. For the next step, I submerge the head in a boiling hot water for about 1 minute. I call it a hot dolls yoga. After that, it's pretty easy to remove the head without destroying the neck peg. When the head is still warm and soft, it is also easier to extract the remaining hair plugs. With the head properly bald, I can move to the next step, wiping off the factory face with 100% acetone. At this point you may call a head ready for customization, but I personally can't move on without shrinking my heads first. I am working on a small head shrinking tutorial, so stay tuned if you're interested. Abby's body was a bit dirty and it is originally covered with glitter, so I wiped it clean with a non-acetone nail polish remover. It didn't remove all the glitter, but I handled it later with some sanding sponges. It was finally time to reconnect the shrunken head with the more or less clean body. To do so, I had to trim down the neck peg, widen the neck hole, and slim down the neck. Then I heated the head using my hairdryer, and when it got soft and more squishy, I put it back onto the neck. A little touch up to the head to neck transition, and we were ready for some sculpting. I wanted her head to be an actual rose flower in full bloom, so I took a super sculpey ultralight clay to create the base for it. I don't like working with this clay, it's pretty nasty, but it is very lightweight, which was a priority here. This was a trust the process part, cause at that point she looked like an egghead and a Smurf crossover.
Who's that wonderful girl? Could she be any cuter?
To remove the eggshell from the head safely, I gently heated it up with a heat gun on lower settings. It kinda pre-baked the clay, so it became harder and less squishy. The inside was not, but that wasn't an issue. Marked the placement and baked my eggshell in the oven, following the instructions on the clay's package. After it cooled down, I glued it to the doll's head. Let's make the rose petals. I used cold porcelain clay and mixed it with few drops of red acrylic paint. I rolled it out to get a sheet of clay of even thickness. With petal cutters, I cut out the shapes. I used a piece of EVA foam and a ball tool to thin down the edges and make the petals look a little more organic. To create the texture on the petals, I just pressed each one between two parts of the silicone mold. I added a little bit of brown pastel shading to the edges. A little plastic paint palette helped the petals keep their shape. I smeared a thin layer of Elmer's glue on our doll's egghead and I started gluing the petals from the smallest to the biggest. And ta-dam! We have our rose. But as they say, there's no rose without thorns. So I needed to add some here too. First, with a hard rubbery milling cutter, I created few indentations on the doll's forehead. With epoxy sculpt, I blended the petals with the head and I sculpted the thorns, one by one. It was a tedious job, not enough space for fingers, and epoxy was very stubborn and didn't want to stick to the vinyl, but in the end, I managed to make them all. When the epoxy cured, I sanded down the transition line and refined the shape of the thorns a little bit. To secure the rose flower from the paint, I covered it under plastic wrap. Then I turned my girl into a cozy burrito and sprayed the face with white primer. I removed the wrapping from the flower and unfortunately I wasn't happy with the shade of the red color. I wanted it to be more burgundy and less scarlet. So I took my good old airbrush and fixed it with acrylic paint. I also sprayed this color a little bit on the forehead, temples, ears, occiput and under the jaw. 3 layers of Mr. Super Clear Matte Varnish, and it was finally time to give this girl her new face. There was a big shortage of MSC in Europe between November and February, so I couldn't get my favorite UV cut flat. This is why I used regular matte here. But it is back in shops again, so later I could go back to UV protection, which, to be honest, works a little bit better for me. At first I wanted the face to be just pink and red, but the result was looking a little bit boring, so I decided to add some green tones to it. Straight away it spoke to me way more, so good decision. You can have a plan for your design, but don't be afraid to modify it or add to it. Worst case scenario, you can almost always go back to the original idea, especially with face-ups on your dolls. Just seal your progress frequently and you can experiment as you please. As I said at the beginning, my goal with this character was to make her really beautiful. Not like Disney Princess's beauty, but like Marilyn Monroe's super feminine beauty. A beauty that gives a bit of seductive and maybe a little bit vain vibe. Those are some character traits that I would give to a personification of a rose. Like, not straight up evil, but definitely knowing her worth. Normally for this kind of character I would use maybe Spectra, cause her face sculpt is quite beautiful and adult looking. Or maybe one of the feline face sculpts, cause they work pretty great with seductive looking face-ups, at least in my opinion. Abby, however, despite being quite sassy and beautiful character, has something in her face that makes her less ideal for projects like that. A strong jaw and visible underbite makes it more challenging. But a small challenge from time to time never hurt anybody, right? Of course, I could shave the lower lip and the jawline to make the overbite less prominent and the features more delicate. But I really didn't want to do that. I saw the potential in this face. So I worked with what I had, and I did my best. Sure think that our stereotypical beauty needed some beauty marks. There's always a moment in the face-up when you're starting to really see if it's going in the right direction. And either you have to go back and start over, or you're happy and stop questioning your base doll decisions. And here I started to feel confident about mine. So confident, in fact, that I decided to try something unconventional and gave her a chin dimple. In Poland we call it dupka na brodzie, which can be translated as a chin butt. And yeah, it is not really a classic feminine beauty trait. But I wanted to try it anyway, and I think it gave our rose some uniqueness and added a nice oomph to the character. So the chin butt stays. I really wanted to post this video over a month ago, but unfortunately life happened. You know what they say, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. So March was a month of addressing some of my health-related issues. I won't call them problems, just issues, cause I want to be clear, I am healthy and fine, no need to worry. I just had some minor concerns and needed to check everything to be sure I'm okay. Since I know that I am back. I'm trying not to be mad at myself and not feel sorry for this small pause in uploading, cause health should always be our priority. We need to be patient with ourselves and with creators that we like, cause we all have lives and human bodies to take care of. Anyway, this face-up was done and I believe I really managed to achieve what I wanted. So here's an original Abby to compare the head size and the new and old face. I am pretty content with this face-up. To the body then. I secured the head under a plastic wrap and started cutting my doll into pieces. To make the torso more organic and less stiff-looking, I will bend her spine and lift one of the hips a little bit. So the middle part of the torso had to go. I also straightened up the neck, removed one of the arms and carved into the shoulder. Because I wanted to position that arm a bit higher, I had to say bye-bye to the left boob too. I modified right leg by carving into the hip socket, thigh, removing and sanding down the shin. After that I removed all the rough edges, plastic panties, seams and all that jazz. Also decided to modify the left groin and the left knee joint. And I created small holes for wires that will connect all the pieces later. Sanding the pieces with sanding sponges smooths the roughness but also leaves a nice texture for the clay and paint to grab on. Just like my lilac fairy, this little beauty will be sitting on a vase. So I 3D printed one from an STL file I found on thingiverse.com. I needed it at that moment to properly position my fairy. I was frequently checking the position of the doll on the edge of the vase while gluing the body pieces together with hot glue and super glue. When it's time for epoxy, I like to divide the sculpting phase just to have easier access to some parts and to be sure that I won't accidentally squish the ones that are already sculpted. So here I left the lower part of the body still not glued in place and focused on the neck, arms and stomach. I let the epoxy to harden enough to stop being squishy and gave our beauty her well-deserved boob job. I created 3 indentations in each breast. That might look weird now, but it will make sense later. It was finally time to glue the legs in place. And sculpt those hips and buns. And knees, of course. I let the epoxy cure completely, and I gave our girl a good exfoliation treatment. I tried to smooth out the transitions between clay and plastic as much as possible. Then, with my micromotor, I created more indentations on her body. Those indentations marked the placement of the thorns that I wanted to implement into the design. My cactus fairy has needles on her body, and it makes her sad, cause she just wants to be hugged. The rose fairy has thorns, but it doesn't bother her, cause all she wants is admiration. No touchy-touchy. The thorns were a bit tricky to sculpt. The fresh part of clay didn't want to stick to the body that well, but with a lot of patience and determination, and a good amount of swearing, I managed to finish this part of the job. And with that, the sculpting phase was done. When the epoxy cured, all I needed to do was to sharpen those thorns a little bit, and my girl was ready to get some colors. I primed her body with white spray paint and 3 layers of Mr. Super Clear varnish. All that gave me a good base for pan pastels. Of course, I tried my best to recreate the color scheme on the face. At the beginning, it looked more like a dragon fruit coloristically, but with every single layer of varnish and blushing, it became more and more what I actually wanted. But dragon fruit fairy sounds quite dope, so maybe I will consider this concept in the future. At some point I decided to stop for a second and drill the holes for the wings before final layers of blushing. When I was happy enough with the body, I painted the thorns red by lifting the pigment from watercolor pencil with a wet brush. With the same method, I painted her toenails and fingernails. Then I could finally add my favorite details, beauty marks. Last thing to do before removing the head wrap was to add some shading and highlights to the thorns. After that part was done and sealed, I said bye-bye to the wrap and fixed the imperfection on the neck that the wrap left. This time I also needed to glue the head in place, something I usually skip. The clay rose made the head just too heavy, so it was necessary here. I sprayed the doll with last layer of Mr. Super Clear UV Cut flat varnish to seal the finished work and added the glossy finish to all the thorns, the rose petals, the eyes and the lips. Our little fairy still needed her fairy wings, and they had to be the fairest of them all. I mean, duh. I made the bases like I always do, using my old but gold resin wings method. I came up with it while working on my bone fairy in April 2021, so happy birthday to this method! If you want to see full process of how I make the resin base for my wings, check out some other fairy videos on my channel. For example, the lilac fairy. Here I painted the wings using a monarch butterfly as an inspiration. because it's such a beautiful species in my opinion, and I thought that it will suit this red rose beauty quite well. The black patterns and white dots I painted by hand with acrylics and then used some yellow and red transparent paint to airbrush the color gradient. As you can see, the white spots on this side needed some touch-ups. And the paint job was done. I could seal it under 2 thin layers of UV resin, cured under an UV lamp. I also needed to paint over the wire that was visible on the other side and cover that with resin again. To make sure that the resin won't be sticky after curing, I hid it once again with an UV light, but this time from under the water bath. I learned this trick from my viewers and it works wonders. I repeated the same process on all the remaining wings and voila! It was time to glue the wings in their rightful place. I had to gently bend the wires to position the wings as I wanted. Needed to be careful to not crack the resin. When I was happy with the positioning, I glued the wings one by one with a superglue. I think I achieved my goal here, and I managed to make this girl quite a beauty. She's pretty and she knows it. But the project was far from finished. She still needed her stand. So let's go back to the vase. First of all, I needed to sand everything down to remove the imperfections like printing failures and lines and support marks. The vase was a little wobbly, so I evened the bottom on a belt sander. To make my print even smoother, I brushed on 2 layers of printing resin, curing it under an UV lamp. Wiped with alcohol and repeated on each side. Because I still wasn't satisfied with the smoothness, I used high-grit sanding sponges for more polished look. Wiped the dust away and sprayed the vase with black primer. Looked pretty neat, but I wanted to give it some more pizzazz, so I masked the majority of the vase, leaving only 2 stripes exposed, one thicker and one thinner. Then I sprayed the vase with white first and then with gold spray paint on top. The masking wasn't perfect, but after a little fixing, it looked somewhat decent. Okay, we have our vase. Time to make some everlasting flowers. First I took a bunch of floristic wires and cut them in half. Then I took an ultralight super sculpey and created the buds for my roses. Those will be the cores for each flower. I poked the hole in the thicker part of the bud, so I won't have to drill it after baking the clay. I baked the buds and let them cool down. After that, they were pretty hard and very lightweight. And ready to be glued on the wires. By the way, I decided on 12 flowers, cause dozen roses somehow sounded right to me. Since you already know how I made the petals, let's skip this part. Nice. From green tinted cold porcelain, I made a hip for each flower. Used Elmer's glue to make it stick to the wire and to the petal part, because this kind of clay doesn't stick to itself that well when it's cured. From the same green clay, I created the sepals, the leaf-like formations enclosing the petals of the flower. Just like with petals, I rolled a thin sheet of clay on a piece of plexiglass and then used a special cutter to get the proper star-like shapes. After getting all 12 pieces cut out, I transferred them one by one onto the piece of foam and used a ball tool to thin down the edges and made them more organic looking. Then I made tiny incisions on the edges. With dark green and red pastels, I added shading to the sepal. And I smeared some Elmer's glue on it to connect it with the rose. I shaped the sepals so they would look somewhat natural. Repeat it on all 12 roses, of course. Let's make some leaves. I once again rolled down a sheet of green clay, but this time I used a leaf-shaped cutters to get the pieces. I thinned the edges with a ball tool and I pressed on the impression of the leaf by using a silicone mold. I dipped the end of a piece of thin floristic wire in glue and placed it in the middle of the leaf. Then I pressed the clay around it. When my leaves cured a bit, I added a bit of clay at their bases. And when those hardened as well, I shaded them with pastels. I sprayed them with a gloss varnish and they were ready to multiply. And it was time to assemble our flowers. I cut few pieces of floristic tape, stretched it, folded it, cut in half, and unwind it. With the tape prepared like that, I wrapped the flower pieces, putting them together. When the roses were fully assembled, I took a green cold porcelain and created the stems. I had a bunch of pre-prepared thorns that I made from the leftover red clay while I was working on the petals. So now I could just dip them in a bit of glue and press them into the stem. Last thing left to do here was to blush the stems and thorns with brown, red and green pastels, and sealed everything with gloss varnish. With all of that being done, I could finally introduce the roses and the fairy to the vase and play a little with some flower arrangement. But first, I took a bunch of metal bolts and nuts and I put them into the vase to make the bottom heavier so the weight of the flowers won't make the whole thing fall over. Then I placed the fairy and all the roses one by one. To make the base even sturdier and the placement of the roses permanent, I decided to pour some epoxy resin into the vase. I mixed resin and hardener in 2:1 ratio. I used my vacuum chamber to remove the air bubbles that were introduced to the resin while stirring. This time I did it not for aesthetic reasons, because the resin won't be visible, but to make it as dense and heavy as possible. To make sure that I won't spill the resin everywhere during pouring, I used a syringe to transfer the resin into the vase. I only had this small one, so it took some time. I also ended up mixing another batch of resin to fill the vase properly. The resin needed 72 hours to cure completely, so let's see our girl in 3 days. The resin finally hardened so I could remove the tapes, glue the doll in place, and add a very last detail to the project, the dewdrops. I made them with UV resin and hit them with an UV torch. And with this last little step, the whole Rose Fairy project was finally done. I must admit that I am really happy with how this girl turned out. The base for the face was way less challenging than I thought it would be, and the vibe that the finished doll is giving totally reflect what I was aiming for. Beautiful and definitely vain, but she's not like an evil type, more like I know my worth type of a character. She just wants to be admired, from afar. Of course, my flower manufacture took way more time than I anticipated. I just don't know why I'm still trying to estimate the time I need for something new, while I suck at those calculations so much. But in the end, the vase and the roses ended up pretty okay, so I guess they were worth the time. But I would love to hear your thoughts about my Rose Fairy. Was she worth the wait? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the process, you can give this video a like and share it with your friends. Your engagement really helps with the algorithm, so I highly appreciate it. If you want to see more of my doll shenanigans, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and if you want to support me outside YouTube, you can buy me a virtual coffee at ko-fi.com. I appreciate all kind of your support, so don't feel pressured. As long as you enjoy my videos and I enjoy my craft, I am happy. For more updates and sneak peeks, you can join me on my Instagram or X. Thank you guys for watching, and see you soon!
Ale w nosek to cię podrapało. Bardzo ładna postawa, papika. Mama approved.